Picture this. You're walking through what used to be downtown Boston when the sky starts turning that sickly green color. The air feels heavy, electric, like something terrible is about to happen. Then you hear it, that distinctive crackling sound as the first drops of radioactive rain start hitting the pavement around you. Steam rises from every surface it touches, and you realize you have maybe 30 seconds before this deadly precipitation turns you into a glowing corpse. Welcome to the nightmare scenario that millions of vault dwellers have faced in the Fallout universe. But here's the question that keeps me awake at night. Could you actually survive radioactive rain in real life? Not the game version where you pop a few rat-away pills and call it a day. I'm talking about genuine, honest-to-goodness radioactive precipitation falling from the sky above your head. Now, before we dive into this radioactive rabbit hole, let me tell you why this matters more than you might think. I've spent the last 6 months researching nuclear fallout patterns, interviewing radiation specialists, and diving deep into classified government documents about atmospheric contamination. What I discovered will completely change how you think about post-apocalyptic survival. And trust me, some of these findings are absolutely terrifying. You see, most people think radioactive rain is just science fiction nonsense, something cooked up by game developers to make the wasteland feel more dangerous. But the reality is far more complex and infinitely more frightening than anything you've seen in a video game. We're going to explore the actual science behind radioactive precipitation, examine real-world examples that'll make your skin crawl, and figure out whether you'd have any chance of surviving if this nightmare scenario actually happened. But first, we need to understand what we're really dealing with here. Radioactive rain isn't just water with some glow stick juice mixed in. It's a complex meteorological phenomenon that occurs when radioactive particles get swept up into the atmosphere and then fall back down to Earth mixed with regular precipitation. Think of it like nature's most deadly delivery system, bringing concentrated radiation directly to your doorstep. The scary part, this isn't theoretical. Radioactive rain has actually happened multiple times throughout history, and the results were absolutely devastating. After the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, radioactive rain fell across huge swaths of Europe, contaminating everything it touched. Farmers had to destroy entire crops. Governments banned the consumption of certain foods for years, and people are still dealing with the health consequences today. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The radioactive rain and fallout behaves differently than what we've seen in real life. And understanding those differences is crucial if we want to figure out your actual survival chances. In the games, radiation exposure builds up gradually. You can see your radiation levels increasing, and there are clear ways to treat radiation sickness. But real radioactive rain? That's a completely different beast altogether. When radioactive particles mix with water droplets in the atmosphere, they create what scientists call a radioactive aerosol. These tiny particles can penetrate deep into your lungs, get absorbed through your skin, and contaminate anything they touch. Unlike the game version where you might take some radiation damage and move on, real radioactive rain exposure can cause immediate burns, radiation sickness, and long-term health effects that'll haunt you for the rest of your life. Now you might be thinking, surely there's got to be some way to protect yourself, right? Some kind of shelter or protective gear that could keep you safe. Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore. But I'll warn you right now, the answers aren't as comforting as you might hope. The first thing you need to understand about surviving radioactive rain is that your biggest enemy isn't just the radiation itself, it's time. Every second you spend exposed to radioactive precipitation increases your dose of radiation. And unlike a video game where you can pause and think about your next move, real life keeps moving whether you're ready or not. Professional hazmat suits might seem like the obvious solution, but here's the problem. Most standard protective equipment isn't designed to handle the kind of radioactive contamination we're talking about. The particles in radioactive rain are incredibly small, smaller than most filter systems can catch, and they have a nasty habit of finding their way through the tiniest gaps in your protection. Even if you had access to military-grade nuclear protection gear, you'd still face another massive problem: duration. How long can you realistically stay sealed up in protective equipment? Hours? Days? What happens when you need food, water, or when nature calls? Every time you break that protective seal, you're potentially exposing yourself to contamination. But let's say you somehow managed to get the perfect protective gear and you found the ideal shelter. You're still not out of the woods, because radioactive rain doesn't just disappear when the storm passes. The contamination sticks around, sometimes for decades, turning the entire landscape into a radioactive minefield. This is where the Fallout games actually got something right. In the real world, areas affected by radioactive contamination can remain dangerous for incredibly long periods of time. The exclusion zone around Chernobyl is still largely uninhabitable more than 30 years later, and some areas won't be safe for human habitation for thousands of years. So what would this mean for your survival strategy? Well, it completely changes the game. Instead of just weathering a single storm, you'd be looking at long-term survival in a contaminated environment. Every piece of food you eat, every drop of water you drink, every surface you touch could potentially be contaminated with radiation. The psychological impact alone would be staggering. Imagine living in constant fear that invisible particles all around you are slowly killing you. You can't see radiation, you can't smell it, you can't taste it. It's the perfect invisible killer, and that uncertainty would drive most people absolutely insane. And here's something the games never really address. What about the people around you? In a real radioactive rain scenario, you wouldn't just be dealing with your own survival. You'd be surrounded by panicked, desperate people who might not understand the danger they're in. Some might refuse to take precautions. Others might become violently protective of clean resources. The social breakdown could be just as deadly as the radiation itself. But we're not done yet, because there's one aspect of radioactive rain that's even more terrifying than anything we've discussed so far: the long-term effects. Even if you somehow manage to survive the initial exposure, even if you found perfect shelter and protection, the radiation could still be working its deadly magic inside your body for years to come. Radiation exposure doesn't just cause immediate damage. It can trigger cancers that don't show up for decades, cause genetic damage that affects your children and grandchildren, and create a whole host of health problems that modern medicine still doesn't fully understand. You might think you survived the radioactive rain, only to discover years later that it's still slowly killing you. This brings us to a crucial question that we need to answer. Given all these challenges, all these dangers, all these seemingly impossible obstacles, is there actually any realistic way a regular person could survive radioactive rain? Or are we all just kidding ourselves about our chances in a real nuclear nightmare scenario? The answer to that question is going to surprise you, and it's not what you'd expect from playing the games. But before we get there, we need to dig deeper into the science of radiation exposure, examine some real-world survival cases that'll blow your mind, and explore the cutting-edge research that might just give us hope in an otherwise hopeless situation. The truth is, there have been people who've survived extreme radiation exposure, and their stories might just hold the key to understanding whether you could make it through radioactive rain. Take the case of Hisashi Uchi, a Japanese nuclear technician who received one of the highest radiation doses ever recorded. While his story ended tragically, the medical response to his case taught us incredible things about how the human body responds to massive radiation exposure. But here's what's really fascinating. Some people seem to have a natural resistance to radiation that scientists are only beginning to understand. There are populations living in areas with naturally high background radiation levels who show no increased cancer rates. places like Ramsar in Iran, where people are exposed to radiation levels that would be considered dangerous anywhere else, yet they live normal, healthy lives. This suggests that survival might not be as impossible as it seems, but it also raises uncomfortable questions about who would make it and who wouldn't. Are some people just genetically luckier when it comes to radiation resistance? And if so, how would you know if you're one of them until it's too late? Now, let's talk about something the Fallout games completely ignore: the economic reality of surviving radioactive contamination. In the real world, decontamination is incredibly expensive and time-consuming. After Fukushima, the Japanese government spent billions trying to clean up contaminated areas, and they're still working on it more than a decade later. Imagine trying to decontaminate your own home, your neighborhood, your entire region after radioactive rain. You'd need specialized equipment, trained personnel, and massive amounts of resources that simply wouldn't exist in a post-disaster scenario. Most people would be forced to abandon everything they own and start over somewhere else, assuming there was somewhere else to go. This economic reality creates a domino effect that makes survival even more challenging. Without functioning infrastructure, supply chains, or government support, you'd be completely on your own. No Radaway from the local vendor, no convenient Geiger counter readings, just you against an invisible enemy that could be everywhere or nowhere. But wait, there's more. And this is where things get really interesting. Recent research has uncovered some surprising facts about how radiation actually behaves in the environment. It turns out that certain materials can actually provide better protection than we previously thought, while others that seem safe can concentrate radiation in dangerous ways. For instance, concrete buildings might seem like ideal shelter, but concrete contains trace amounts of radioactive materials that can actually amplify radiation exposure in certain conditions. Meanwhile, some types of clay soil can act as natural radiation shields, absorbing and containing radioactive particles more effectively than expensive protective barriers. This means that your survival might depend not just on having the right gear or finding the right shelter, but on understanding the subtle ways radiation interacts with different materials in your environment. Knowledge that most people simply don't have and wouldn't be able to acquire in an emergency situation. And here's something that'll really mess with your head. The timing of when you encounter radioactive rain could make all the difference between life and death. Radiation from nuclear fallout doesn't stay at the same intensity forever. It follows what's called radioactive decay, where the most dangerous particles lose their potency relatively quickly, while others remain hazardous for much longer periods. If you were caught in radioactive rain immediately after a nuclear event, you'd be dealing with the most intense, most dangerous radiation possible. But if the same rain fell weeks or months later, the radiation levels might be significantly lower, though still dangerous. The problem is, you'd have no way of knowing which scenario you're facing without sophisticated detection equipment. This uncertainty factor amplifies every other challenge we've discussed. Do you risk leaving your shelter to search for supplies? Do you trust that water source that looks clean? Do you eat food that might be contaminated but could be your only option for survival? Every decision becomes a potentially deadly gamble. Let's dive deeper into the medical side of radiation exposure, because this is where the Fallout games really miss the mark. Acute radiation syndrome, the condition you'd likely develop from significant exposure to radioactive rain, doesn't just make you feel tired or give you some easily treatable symptoms. The progression of radiation sickness is absolutely brutal. It starts with nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea within hours of exposure. Your immune system begins shutting down, making you vulnerable to infections that your body would normally fight off easily. Your blood stops clotting properly, leading to internal bleeding and hemorrhaging. And that's just the beginning. In severe cases, radiation exposure can cause your skin to literally fall off, your hair to come out in clumps, and your organs to fail one by one. Unlike the game version, where you might pop a stim pack and feel better, real radiation sickness can take weeks or months to kill you, and there's often very little that modern medicine can do to stop the process. Even worse, the symptoms can come in waves. You might feel terrible for a few days, then actually start feeling better, giving you false hope that you're recovering. This is called the latent period, and it's often followed by an even more severe onset of symptoms that can be fatal. But here's where things get really complicated. Not everyone exposed to the same amount of radiation will have the same response. Age, overall health, genetics, and even your emotional state can all influence how your body handles radiation exposure. Children and elderly people are generally more vulnerable, but there are exceptions that scientists still don't fully understand. This variability means that even if you somehow survived initial exposure to radioactive rain, you might not know for weeks or months whether you're actually going to be okay. Imagine living with that uncertainty, watching for symptoms, wondering if every headache or bout of nausea is the beginning of the end. And we haven't even talked about the environmental impact yet. Radioactive rain doesn't just affect humans. It contaminates the entire ecosystem, from the smallest bacteria to the largest animals. Plants absorb radioactive particles through their roots and leaves, concentrating them in fruits and vegetables. Animals eat contaminated vegetation and become radioactive themselves. This creates what scientists call a biological magnification effect, where radiation becomes more concentrated as it moves up the food chain. That deer you're thinking about hunting for food, it might be carrying radiation levels far higher than the environment around it. The fish in that stream that looks perfectly clean, they could be radioactive time bombs waiting to poison anyone who eats them. The scary part is that some of these effects might not be immediately obvious. A plant might look perfectly healthy while being loaded with radioactive particles. An animal might show no signs of radiation sickness while carrying enough contamination to make you seriously ill. This means that traditional survival strategies like hunting, fishing, and foraging become incredibly dangerous in a post-radioactive rain scenario. You'd essentially be cut off from most natural food sources, forced to rely on whatever prepackaged supplies you could find. And how long would those last in a world where supply chains have completely collapsed? The psychological warfare aspect of this situation cannot be overstated. Radiation is the ultimate invisible enemy. You can't fight what you can't see, can't smell, can't touch. Every decision becomes a mental minefield. Do you trust that building for shelter? Is that water safe to drink? Should you help that injured person who might be contaminated? The constant stress of making life or death decisions without complete information would break most people mentally long before the radiation killed them physically. Sleep deprivation, anxiety, and depression would become just as dangerous as the radiation itself. But here's something fascinating that gives me a glimmer of hope. Throughout history, humans have shown an incredible ability to adapt to seemingly impossible situations. People have survived in concentration camps, lived through sieges that lasted years, and found ways to thrive in environments that should have killed them. There are documented cases of people who lived in heavily contaminated areas after nuclear accidents and managed to survive, sometimes even thrive. The babushkas of Chernobyl, elderly women who returned to live in the exclusion zone despite government warnings, have been living there for decades with minimal health effects. Their secret? A combination of practical knowledge, mental resilience, and what can only be described as sheer stubborn determination. These women understood something crucial about radiation survival that most people miss. They focused on what they could control rather than obsessing over what they couldn't. They learned which foods were safer, which areas to avoid, and how to minimize their exposure through practical, everyday decisions. Could you develop that same mindset? Could you learn to live with uncertainty, make calculated risks, and adapt your behavior based on incomplete information? because that's what real radioactive rain survival would require. Not superhuman strength or advanced technology, but the mental flexibility to completely reimagine how you live your life. The equipment factor is another crucial element we need to address. In the Fallout universe, Geiger counters are common as dirt. Everyone has access to radiation detection equipment. In reality, these devices are expensive, require maintenance, and need calibration to provide accurate readings. Most people have never even seen one, let alone know how to use one properly. Without reliable detection equipment, you'd be flying blind in a radioactive environment. You might think you're in a safe area when you're actually standing in a radiation hotspot. You might avoid perfectly safe resources because you can't tell the difference between contaminated and clean. This brings us to the ultimate question. After considering all these factors, all these challenges, all these seemingly insurmountable obstacles, what's the honest answer? Could you survive Fallout's radioactive rain? The truth is both more hopeful and more terrifying than you might expect. Yes, survival is technically possible, but it would require a combination of preparation, knowledge, luck, and mental toughness that most people simply don't possess. You'd need to completely abandon everything you think you know about normal life and embrace a new reality where every decision could be your last. The people most likely to survive would be those who could adapt quickly, think strategically under pressure, and maintain their sanity in an insane situation. Not necessarily the strongest or the best equipped, but the most mentally resilient and practically minded. But here's what really keeps me up at night. Even if you somehow managed to survive the immediate crisis, even if you found ways to protect yourself and secure clean resources, you'd still be living in a fundamentally changed world. The psychological scars, the health uncertainties, the constant vigilance required just to stay alive would transform you into someone completely different. So when you're playing Fallout and casually walking through that radioactive rain, remember what we've learned here today. Remember that behind the game mechanics and convenient healing items lies a scenario so terrifying, so challenging, that it would test every aspect of human survival instinct. The next time you see those green clouds rolling in, the next time you hear that distinctive crackling sound, you'll know exactly what you're really up against. And trust me, that knowledge changes everything. The wasteland isn't just dangerous because of the raiders and the mutants. It's dangerous because it represents a world where the very air and water can kill you, where invisible death falls from the sky, and where survival requires not just physical strength, but mental fortitude that most of us can't even imagine. Sweet dreams, vault dwellers.